Welcome back. Joining me live now is my political panel, Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director of the Australia Institute, and Emily Dye, Policy Director at the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. Thank you both for joining me. Emily, Joe Biden has declared victory. Is it concerning that Donald Trump hasn't conceded defeat yet?
Oh, very much so. I think it's concerning for the state of our democracy that the leader of the United States is questioning the votes. Biden has won by nearly 5 million American votes. He easily got the popular vote, and it appears has also pretty comfortably gotten the Electoral College. At this point, I think Trump should concede the election and admit he is lost, and the American people have spoken, and really respect the system.
Ebony, what's your response to that? I also want to hear what you have to say about Kamala Harris. She wore white, representing the suffragette movement. What did you make of her speech?
I thought she was wonderful, as was Joe Biden's speech. And it's obviously a historic election, not just for the record turnout from both Republicans and Democrats, but because of the election of Kamala Harris as Vice President, the first female Vice President. She's also African-American and from South Asian descent. It'll be a huge inspiration to people from those communities, but of course to little girls across America and the globe. And, as Emily said, just a huge result for the Biden campaign, winning the popular vote by more than 4 million. But really puts Australia on notice as well. One of the first things President Joe Biden will do in office is make America rejoin the Paris Agreement. And he's signalled that he's willing to go after countries that aren't pulling their weight on climate. And that includes countries like Australia. Currently, we're still planning to use our Dodgy carryover Kyoto credits to meet our Paris commitments. And that could really put us on the outer of a Biden administration in the future.
Back in Australia, Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell broke this huge story today, revealing that the Andrews government in Victoria rushed to get the Belt and Road deal signed in 2018. Emily, is it a concern that the Victorian government wanted to get this deal through so quickly?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's multiple concerns here. One is the way that the Victorian government really went over the head of the federal government to get this done. I also think that we should be concerned about China and about China's influence in Australia. China has shown their willingness to sanction us just for questioning their role in the coronavirus outbreak. And because of that, I don't think we should necessarily trust them as our key trading partner. We really need to diversify our trading assets with countries such as Canada, New Zealand, and the UK.
Ebony, what do you make of it? The Premier says he hasn't seen that email. Do you think that's a fair enough response?
Yeah, look, I think the only reason that we're paying so much attention to this particular agreement with Victoria is because it's very clear that the Commonwealth government has lost control of Australia's relationship with China at the federal level. If you look closely at the MOU agreement, which is public, one of the key clauses in it says that it's not legally binding. So I don't think we should overreact to this. But certainly there are huge problems with the Australia-China relationship at the moment. And really, while it's always a good idea to diversify, any economist will tell you that, we can't work without China in the long run. It's huge. It's in our region. It's a superpower. We can't just ignore it. And so diplomacy is really the only way out here. We have to be smarter about our relationship with China. We have to be more effective in our diplomacy. And most importantly, we need allies to help deal with a superpower. Australia can't do it on its own. But at the moment, we are seeing huge consequences for Australian trade and exports because of the mismanagement at the Commonwealth government level.
Well, Victoria is easing restrictions tonight and then again in another 2 weeks. I know many Victorians are very excited, including myself. But what hasn't changed is mandatory masks, which is interesting because there's only 4 active cases in Victoria. Emily, do you think it's appropriate that everyone in Victoria still has to wear masks?
Absolutely not. At this point, I think we've got our cases down low enough that people really can choose the level of risk they're comfortable with. The chances of you meeting someone with coronavirus are pretty low when there's only 7 new cases in all of Australia as of yesterday, only 4 in Victoria. That risk has gotten a lot lower, and I think that people should be able to make their own decisions and decide what's best for them instead of having the government mandate it.
Ebony, what about yourself? Do you think that this is a proportionate response now?
I do, and I think it's important as Victoria moves to ease its restrictions slowly that there are other things in place that if there is remaining virus circulating in the community, because we know it can go, a lot of people are asymptomatic. We might not necessarily be on top of cases circulating in the community. And that's always going to be a risk going forward until we have a vaccine. I'm in Canberra. We haven't had a case in, I think, months now, but I still carry a mask with me for when I go to Bunnings, for when I do my grocery shopping. And until we have a vaccine, social distancing and wearing a mask is just smart, and I would hope that we don't have to have mandatory masks in the long term in Victoria. But I think while Victoria is still moving out of its restrictions, it makes sense to keep people aware that virus is still out there and to take precautions while they're easing out of those restrictions.
Emily, the state of disaster has been lifted in Victoria, but the state of emergency remains. Do you think that's fair?
Absolutely not. I think that the Victorian government is trying very hard to hold onto its powers that it's gained during this emergency, and we need to be very wary of that. People have lost a lot of freedoms, and that is very hard on the economy. It's very hard on people's personal lives, and I think that the government really needs to be willing to give more say back to the people and pull back, and now is the time.
Ebony, what's your response?
Yeah, I agree with that. State governments have exercised huge powers, including the ability to curb people's freedom of movement. That's not a power that should be exercised lightly and only when necessary. So I think it's really important that we see more transparency from the Victorian government and real accountability about why restrictions are needed, why these emergency powers are needed. And if they're not, then they shouldn't exercise them. The pandemic is not an excuse to avoid scrutiny or accountability or to exercise powers that they don't need to be exercising. It's important that they have them, but, it's really important that the community understands why and when they're exercising them and can hold the Victorian government to account if they think that they've exceeded their authority.
Ebony and Emily, thank you both so much for joining me this afternoon.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
Wages are growing at their slower, sustained pace.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.